Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Pranav Buggana, founder at Toohla Inc. Toohla is an app which individuals can use to track, reduce, and offset their carbon emissions. Pranav, it's so exciting to chat with you. We were discussing before the show how exciting I am about, just technology that's really helping users be a little bit more conscious and reward them on the conscious decisions that we make, at home in our daily lives around just being a little bit more carbon conscious wherever you stand in regards to climate change. I don't think it's important. I think it's important to enable people and empower them to make just, good decisions globally. And that's always exciting. I think that's fairly, a fairly welcomed idea. But before we get into technology and what you're building and how the build's going, tell us a little bit about what you were doing before you started Toohla.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually don't really have much of a background in climate science and, carbon markets. I was working as a data scientist slash machine learning engineer at Civis Analytics, which is a SaaS startup, B2B SaaS startup based in Chicago. And I was doing a lot of like machine learning modeling and stuff. So I worked on like large media companies, like their like ad targeting strategies, all the way
Yeah.
to I built a bunch of models for like leading political organizations across the country for understanding, the voter base better and like having like personalized sort of communications to like reach out to those groups. So, a lot of analytics experience and tech experience, but my real like passion was sort of trying to like build tech that really makes the world a better place. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how I stumbled upon carbon markets and climate work. So
Yeah, and it's so fascinating just within the machine learning space and building those models. Do you have to how much data do you have to incorporate to actually get a model to start functioning how you either hypothesize it will or how you intend to? And what is involved in that modeling that, kind of the regular non-technical user might not understand, myself included, in terms of, how to structure things so that it actually, you know, you get the result or the output that you're looking for.
yeah, so it's really interesting. I think the field has made a lot of great strides in the last decade or 2 decades. But like you said, the data is really important. I think like getting the data in the right format in like the right place to run the algorithms on it, that's like 90% of the battle.
Yeah.
In school you get all of these, very catered examples of problems to run. But in the real
Yeah.
world, guess what? Data is messy. People might enter like a bunch of typos for their name or, their like the state that they live in or something like that. People change addresses a lot. So if you're like modeling based on geographic features, your data may be already stale because people have moved. So,
Yeah.
just getting that data in a clean format, stripping out the data that's going to increase the noise in the model, but also not doing it in a way that makes your data set biased. Maybe certain demographic groups have noisy data disproportionately compared to others due to various reasons. If you strip out that data in a biased way, then it'll bias your model. So just
Yeah.
really thinking about the biases. And in terms of the how much data do you need question, that's actually a very loaded question for different problems and different questions. You'll need like less data to get to a good conclusion, accurate conclusion. For other problems, let's say, self-driving cars, you need like millions and millions of data
Yeah.
points in order to do that. And it depends on the algorithm that you use. So yeah, I guess
Yeah.
the short answer is
What technology is it built in, just out of curiosity, in regards to like what languages do you commonly see? And if I'm a machine learning, either data scientist or engineer, what am I typically using to create my models or just like interpret data? Is it like SQL databases? Is it, you
yeah.
know, more involved in that?
Yeah, I think, or at least the stack that we used, I can't speak to other folks' stacks. It was all like
Yeah.
Redshift, S3, and then, a lot of people use like NoSQL databases, which I think it's a bit too technical to get into the difference between NoSQL and relational databases. But, I think PyTorch is like basically like a Python sort of package that really makes a lot of common machine learning workflows and dealing with large data sets in the code itself. It makes it a lot
Yeah.
easier. So that's kind of the industry standard. But we were using more of like a proprietary stack and API that Civis internally developed to make
Yeah.
data science easier for data scientists. And so, yeah, that was based off of like AWS
Yeah.
primarily. So,
Yeah, last question on this before we
yeah.
move to Tula. I guess, what are the recent improvements to tech? Do you see a lot of recent improvements to technology? Because I feel like machine learning, AI is becoming so popular. There's a lot of, like ChatGPT just came out, obviously Midjourney and all those alike recently came out to really interpret commands and then, create what you're looking for. Is a lot of the technology advancing in like prepackaged kind of, I
Yeah.
guess, frameworks in a sense? And how quickly is it evolving? Do you have a it comes
Oh,
at.
it is evolving at a rapid clip. Like like literally the last couple years, I was pretty skeptical of like AI solutions. People were like, "Oh, AI is going to automate a bunch of repetitive like jobs, but also even like creative jobs, like
Yeah.
designers or like people in sales or even like software engineers." And I was like, "Nah, that's not gonna happen." And then ChatGPT came out, and I was like, "Wait, this might happen." It's like made like I thought this technology was like at least 5 years away, but clearly it's not. I mean, I've fiddled around with ChatGPT a lot over the last few days, and it is really good in like certain like narrower applications. Like I've actually been using ChatGPT to help me build out the backend for Toola, and like
Really?
it's actually like you can get to the same answers with like Stack Overflow or like Googling, but like it will take you to the right thing like a lot quicker. So it's really cool as like a supplemental tool.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think like in like generative AI, natural language processing, image processing, I think the like you mentioned open source, right? I think there's gonna be a handful of very smart people with access to an unfair amount of data that are going to really dominate actually building out the algorithms and tinkering under the hood to like produce a bunch of packages. And I
Yeah.
think those packages will be available to use for like a broader set of developers on like specific applications. And I think, it's going to be weirdly concentrated and democratized at the same time because,
Yeah.
these tools are available, will be more widely available to use, but the people who are working on the tools will be an increasingly narrow set of people. So,
Yeah. Yeah, no. Does that impact any kind of bit of the technology at Toola? And obviously moving into Toola, what inspired you to go in this direction in particular in terms of the technology that enables people to be rewarded for like consciously
yeah.
making, better and better decisions in terms of a global scale?
Yeah, for sure. So I think like so Tula was basically like I came up with Tula because I wished that this product existed for someone like essentially I like my extended family and my parents and grandparents, they all live in India, right? And I live and work in the US and I was born in the US. I treat it as my home. And every year I have to fly basically to India to like visit all of my family.
Yeah.
And obviously flying is the worst thing that you can do at all for the climate. And I was thinking, it really sucks that I have to sort of choose between like seeing my family and like living where I want and,
Mm.
minimizing my impact on the climate and the environment. And so then I like stumbled upon carbon markets and carbon credits where, you can literally pay money that funds projects that remove or avoid carbon emissions in the future. And I thought this is like a super powerful tool for me because there's certain things that I can compromise on in my life by like reducing emissions, like,
Yeah.
eating more vegetarian food and taking public transit. Like I don't own a car. But when it comes to certain things, there are no good alternatives to like flying. And
Yeah.
that's something I'm not willing to give up in my life. Like a lot of people, we're just human. We can't just renounce everything in our life, right?
Yeah.
And so let me look into carbon credits to offset my flights. And there is not much transparency. And like the UX is really bad for like buying carbon credits for individuals.
Yeah.
It's to this date tailored mainly towards businesses. And fun fact, you can't even buy and hold carbon credits if you're an individual. You have to go through a bunch of KYC, which requires you to be a business. So we want to take that, make it super interpretable and seamless for the user to solve a problem that they're facing, like me living with like, guilt about carbon emissions and, stress about the pending doom that might be imposed on our world. And I thought, why not? Why stop at carbon offsets and carbon credits? Why not provide like a framework and a reward for people to reduce their emissions? Because reducing your emissions first and then offsetting
Yeah.
the rest is like how to do a responsible net zero or carbon neutral strategy. And we wanted to make that easy for everybody.
Yeah. Well, describe carbon credits. Are those something that is given from the government, or is that something that is privately given? Describe what those credits are, and a little bit more about the mechanics of how you can distribute them.
Sure. Yeah. So, at its simplified level, one carbon credit is basically the right to claim 1 ton of negative emissions. And
Yeah.
negative emissions can take two sort of forms. It's like literally like sucking in carbon from the atmosphere and shooting it back into the earth. And, avoided emissions is okay. Like, let's say that, the world continued business as usual, right? If I make some investment, which does a thing that prevents 1 ton of carbon dioxide being
Mhm.
emitted in the future, then that's one negative emission as compared to the future, right? So basically what happens is, a bunch of people called project developers, they'll do things like, plant a bunch of trees in like a plot of land or, protect the forests that otherwise would have been converted into palm oil plantations or, logged for paper or furniture, right? So they'll do this and they'll earn, and, there'll be a third party registry and auditor that will say like, okay, by protecting this forest or planting these number of trees, you are saving 1,000 tons of CO2 from being emitted or removing 1,000 tons of CO2. And then they can sell that 1,000 tons as a carbon credit. And then a company or an individual will buy those up and then claim them in order to offset their own emissions. So it's basically like funding negative carbon elsewhere in order to compensate for the emissions that you emit in your own life.
Fascinating. So it's essentially the some companies are purchasing these credits because maybe inherently they can't avoid these emissions, and then it essentially, what is the benefit to that company in particular? Can they not build or do whatever that they're meaning to do if they don't have those credits built in? Are they kind of pretty much siloed to not being able to?
Yeah. So the benefit for purchasing offset rather than reducing value chain emissions for a company is that, let's take, an airline operator like United, right? For them to basically go like true zero, they basically can't do that because the
Right.
technology for like electric flight isn't there yet, right? For them to actually like go to zero emissions, they'd have to like halt a bunch of operations, invest billions and billions of dollars in technology, wait for that
Yeah.
to go through FAA approval, and then they would be able to reduce their emissions. So obviously, that's not something they could do. But what they
Right.
can do is they can use other avenues to reduce emissions more cheaply. For example, in developing countries, there's a huge threat of deforestation everywhere. And did you know that carbon emissions from what's called land use change represent approximately 24% of global total carbon emissions? And
Wow.
land use change basically means destroying natural ecosystems that absorb carbon naturally from the atmosphere. When you do that, like deforestation or convert peatlands into palm oil plantations, that basically reduces the amount of carbon that's captured in the future, which it has the effect of basically emitting carbon.
Yeah.
And so like we need to halt this in developing countries because they're at the most risk of like having deforestation and land use change. And they're also the most impacted by the climate crisis themselves.
Yeah.
And so the companies can finance that in order to reduce their emissions, but they should also take steps to reduce their own value chain emissions as a first priority.
Yeah. It's so fascinating, the mechanics behind companies purchasing these credits, almost funding projects essentially to be able
Yeah.
to, reduce carbon emissions. Is there a better system for this? Or is this the best system we have right now with
Yeah.
the tools essentially that we have?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be fully transparent and say that there are better systems than carbon offsets and carbon credits. The only problem is they're like, just not exist. They don't exist to the scale that we need them to exist. So
Yeah.
I'll give an example of a better system. That's the cap and trade system, which has actually been implemented in the European Union for the last couple decades or so. That what the cap and trade system is, the EU will say, okay, our goal is to reduce emissions by half by 2030. I don't know the exact goal, but it's a popular goal, right? They'll say like, okay, in order to reach that goal, every year we need to reduce our total emissions across the EU by X amount, right? And that basically means that there's a total carbon budget in the entire EU economy that you have to like follow. Otherwise, you're not hitting your emissions reduction goals, right? And so they'll say, okay, of this total carbon budget in the EU, we're going to allocate that like X amount of emissions to each different company that forms the EU economy.
Yeah.
And so let's say that I have two companies, let's say Starbucks and Target, right? Starbucks and Target both have a carbon budget for 2023. Let's say that Starbucks exceeds the carbon budget by 10 tons. So they've emitted 10 tons more than but the other company undershoots it by 10 tons. So they've emitted 10 tons less, right?
Yeah.
So with the company that has undershot their target, they can sell that 10-ton surplus to the other company in order to like net balance out their emissions. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and if you go over your budget, you have to pay a huge tax. And so this has actually been proved in peer reviewed research to actually reduce overall carbon emissions in the economy by a significant amount. And it's mandated and enforced by the government. Whereas like carbon offsets aren't enforced by the government. They're like purely enforced by nonprofits and it's purely voluntary. Like as a company, I can pull out a carbon neutral by 2050 pledge whenever I want, and I can downscope it whenever I want. But if there's a cap and trade system, I have to pay the tax if I
Yeah.
like don't really reduce my emissions. But unfortunately, many countries and many sectors of the economies aren't in the cap and trade system. And this is like a good tool to have in addition to all the other tools in our toolbox to fight climate change.
Yeah. I won't go into questions about why we can't implement something like that because I think we go on a tangent of politics and policy, which is a
Yeah,
never-ending
yeah,
debate. But talk to me a little
yeah.
bit more about Tula. How are you empowering kind of the everyday users to make conscious decisions, to continue to kind of reward them on those decisions, and also what are the things you've had to learn as someone not coming from a climate change background or climate experience, climate tech experience that were, I guess, maybe not difficult, but
Mhm.
challenging as you're growing and scaling a company?
Yeah. So I think like in terms of what I have to learn, I think that's definitely related to what Tool is offering. I actually have gone through the typical customer journey
Mhm.
that I think a lot of our customers will follow, which is coming into it with no knowledge other than, unless we do something big as a world, we're kind of
Yeah.
screwed in the next few decades. It's estimated that there will be approximately 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. That's an
Right.
estimate that comes from the UN. So already, there's a lot of political instability and like geographic instability because of refugees. But
Yeah.
imagine what's going to happen with 1 billion refugees.
Yeah.
That's mind blowing, right? So the consequences are dire. It's easy to get caught up in like doom and gloom and say, like, oh, the world is going to suck when by the time our kids are like of age, right? But I think through all of that negative press coverage, there is like a glimmer of hope of like, there are specific actions that you can take to minimize your impact and like negative impact and maximize your positive impact. And I had to go through hours and hours of research on like carbon markets, on different data driven, like, okay, what's the carbon footprint of shrimp versus beef? It turns out the carbon footprint of shrimp is like actually way higher than that of beef per
Really?
pound because a lot of like wild caught shrimp, it's caught through like deforesting like mangroves and like coastal ecosystems, which absorb a lot of carbon. So all these kinds of things, we want this info to be accessible to the public and for them to be able to easily incorporate and like optimize their choices for the climate without really having to do all this hours and hours of research themselves.
Yeah.
And so we've created like we're building currently an app which is like a gamified framework that distills a lot of this insight into, okay, if I eat a vegetarian meal, I earn these many points,
Yeah.
or if I take transit, I earn X amount of points. And, there's also going to be a bunch of content where people can learn about things themselves related to like climate friendly decisions and even carbon markets and all of that stuff. And so, you know, it basically like taking these feelings of like helplessness and doom and creating them into and then turning them into feelings of optimism and
Yeah.
agency by actually like, using your smartphone to like track, like, for example, like Duolingo or like
Yeah.
Strava or something. You can like track things, hit PRs, like share your progress with friends. Like it's really meant to be a collaborative thing to like give people agency.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a little bit about the product that we're building so far.
I love that. And so it sounds like you're kind of quantifying the different decisions you have to make through research and seeing what
Yeah.
those actually, have in terms of the effect on carbon, and then also creating a reward-based system to continue people using.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, for anything that's very user input oriented, how do you make decisions around how much the user has to input versus how much you can automate through the technology
Yeah.
that these devices have? For me, at least I don't know if you've done this before, but I was on like a My Fitness Plan app where I was like
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
hit a personal, goal for my fitness with I had to record my meals and everything like that. And it's a little taxing, if you're not fully invested in it. So yeah, how do you kind of balance out how much user input is required versus how much you want to automate it during that process or during the
Yeah, for
building
sure. So
process?
I think like you do need to like strategically use like a ballpark approximations, like averages,
Yeah.
that kind of, and really like interrogate it and test it out with users in the field. So we're actually actively trying to recruit beta testers in order to like test our app and give feedback on it, and I think, for example, if you're trying to like go and offset your meal, let's say that you have a steak or like you have some shrimp or something like that, and you can just basically pay a few bucks to like compensate for that effect through our app. And it just takes a couple buttons. You can basically select the type of food and it'll calculate what's the average portion size ballpark and then convert that into a carbon footprint estimate and automatically show you like how much you need to pay to like buy enough carbon credits to compensate for that meal. And so, it's basically we're using the heuristic of we want maximum two interactions, hopefully one interaction with like data entry for the user. Obviously it's preferable to do it like in a fully automated way, like track everywhere you go, everything you buy. But that's not what we're about so far. Cause like I don't think everyone is like in the current privacy climate. We want to be very privacy forward and like not sell anyone's data, not track too much data, give people ownership of what they want to share with us. So
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and whether it's a good idea or not, take it or leave it. But it'd be interesting to see, the partnerships through, companies like, for instance, like Shake Shack, very much a positive or looking to be net zero in terms of their carbon emissions, and they have a lot of food that they treat not only well in terms of the preparation of it, but also creating alternatives for people who want to be a little bit more carbon friendly or want to be very particular with their diet. So um, hopefully that's in the roadmap for you. But I guess more personally, as a solo founder, what are I guess, how do you go through the challenge of being a solo founder, not only making the decisions,
yeah,
and are you building community around you? And how do you honestly stay mentally kind of sane in the building process? Because there's a lot of highs and lows, and it's difficult
yeah.
not to be able to share them with someone else. What advice would you give for other solo founders out there in terms of pushing through the challenge of building?
Yeah, for sure. I think you hit the nail on the head that like the hardest part about being a solo founder is that, you don't have that team with you, like the emotional aspect, if there's like a crisis, you're basically taking everything on your shoulders and you don't have that person to sort of bounce ideas off of and hype you up and stuff like that. So I would say like if you're a solo founder, try to find and there could be reasons why you're a solo founder. Maybe you don't have an extensive network where you can like recruit someone who has all of the skills that are required to contribute and is also super passionate enough to like leave their whatever six-figure job at a FANG company to come work at your startup, right? Or maybe you just want to keep more control of the vision of the business and you want to do it yourself. And I think a lot of shops like YC or like VC funds, they'll say like, oh, you just need to get a co-founder, right? But I think that if you have solid unit economics, if you have great traction, if all the fundamentals of your business are good and the investors can smell the money, then I think that's going to be something that they'll say, okay, I will write you a check, but you should really find a co-founder, right? That's what they did. That's what YC did with Dropbox, right? So stay the course, always interrogate your assumptions on like, why am I doing this as a solo founder? And like, if you have a clear answer to that in your head, then just keep doing what you're doing and don't and tune out the noise. And I would say
Yeah.
like the second thing is surround yourself with people who can play that co-founder role, except don't come with the baggage of like them being a full co-founder from an equity perspective,
Yeah.
where they're like super motivated and maybe instead of giving them like 3% equity, you give them 6% equity or something like that. So they're like doubly incentivized to make the company work. So
Yeah.
those are the two pieces of advice I'd have.
Yeah, love that. Love that. And tell us a little bit about the traction. So the product's in beta. You're having a
Yeah.
lot of beta testers. How many testers do you have, and when is kind of your timeline to launching the full product?
Yeah, for sure. So we still haven't finished the beta yet. We're still in the prototype phase. So we're going to do like, a limited friends and family release for the prototype itself, where like we'll probably have like a Wizard of Oz backend. A lot of stuff will be Flintstone, but it'll basically just be like usability testing and like, just sniffing for more bugs. And then once we iterate once or twice on that, we're going to aim for like a beta testing list of, let's say, 100 to 500 people. And then from then on, we'll be launching the MVP. Target date is end January, mid February, like that for the MVP release. And, we want to push out the beta in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Incredible.
So that's kind of what it looks like
Yeah.
so far.
Next question I have, and so excited to see that not only the beta is kind of up and running and it's getting close to being launched, and if we're on the short list for as an audience, as a guest as well, would love to be on the short list to test it out. But what are some of
Sure.
the biggest challenges that Toohla faces getting not only, or biggest challenges slash risks that Toohla faces today?
Yeah. So I think some of the biggest challenges, obviously, it comes with the territory of like, first time founder and, cold starting a B2C app.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, whenever I say like, oh, I'm working on a D2C mobile app, people are like, oh, really? Like, that's what you're doing? How come you're not doing like a B2B SaaS thing, which relies on some proprietary algorithm?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, like, because, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But so yeah, pulling the initial set of users out of thin air and really iterating towards product market fit is I'd say the biggest challenge that faces us. Another thing, like another challenge is that the market for carbon credits is so opaque. It is actually quite a large market. The voluntary carbon market was around $2-3 billion of transacted volume last year. And it had doubled last year compared to previous
Wow.
year. And it's expected to go all the way to 50 to 100 billion by 2030 or 2050. One of those, I think 100 billion by 2050, 50 by 2030. But a lot of that transaction volume is like not very frequent. It's like two companies trading millions and millions of dollars of credits between
Yeah.
them, right? And like a bilateral trade. So for us, obviously, we'd be lucky to have like a small fraction of that transaction volume in our initial startup phase. So finding the mix of like high quality carbon credits from like reputable
Yeah.
sources that we can buy in small quantities is like one of the biggest challenges. I have to like network my way into the whole thing
Mm.
by going to a bunch of conferences and reaching out to a bunch of people on LinkedIn. But we finally are about to sign with like our first vendor.
Incredible.
So that side of the double-sided market problem is pretty much solved, and now we need to focus on demand generation.
Incredible. And how, or in terms of go-to-market strategies, creating that demand, what are some strategies that you're looking to deploy? And what's exciting, and what are you kind of still have questions about as a initial launch?
Yeah. So for the initial launch, we're trying to hit places and forums, digital and physical, and networks where we believe a lot of our target segment hangs out. So, for example, subreddits for like public transit advocacy, I think they would love this solution because finally they
Yeah.
can be like tangibly rewarded for like using public
Yeah.
transit in like an app. And, people who go to shop at REIs, our plan is to actually literally go and hang out at REIs and be like, hey, like, you care about like the environment that you're hiking in? Like, check out our solution. It's super easy, right? So just like meet them where they hang, push it out through these domains and try to get on podcasts where like there's a disproportionate audience of founders and startup investors that love trying the latest technology and new solutions and are willing to be part of it. So, it's really an all of the above, but targeted approach. Like we're not trying to burn a bunch of money on
Sure.
like banner ads or anything like that. We're trying to really get that organic tag growing.
I
So,
love that. I love that. And if everything goes well,
yeah.
what's the long-term vision for Toola?
Yeah, the long-term vision for Toola is that, first of all, play a central role in moving the globe towards a net zero
Hmm.
future by 2050. And then another goal is I want Toola to be like a household name in sustainability where if people see like the Toola certification, Toola brand on it, they know that choice that they're making is a better choice for the environment and mainly for the
Yeah.
climate. Um, I feel like I want people to turn to Tula for a source of information on how they can minimize their negative impacts on the environment and get involved and really join this global movement of people working together for a better future.
Yeah, it's
So,
incredible. Just to see, not only the ability that companies have now to build technology to empower people, but also the creative reward system. I think, there's so many companies out there that are now shifting to not only rewarding their user base, but also educating them. And it creates a
yeah.
whole experience and community around these products, which I think everyone's kind of craving for a little bit more connection with whatever they're using. I think it's like two sides of the coin, right? It's either like so easy, I don't even think about, using it, and it's so part of my day-to-day life. And then also the more thoughtful choice of, using technology and products and how it kind of, communicates some kind of external image of myself, which is, I think the right move for that a lot of companies are going into, which I'm excited to see how it plays out. But I always like to ask this. I know we're coming to the end of the episode here, but I always like to ask this question to founders, not only for my selfish research purposes, but also for my audience. What books or people have influenced you the most, whether it was early in your career or now?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that, like, in terms of books, I've been reading Almost Done with the Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen. I think for a lot of like D2C founders, like any founders whose business relies on network
Yeah.
effects, it is a must read. Like he really goes into the mechanics of how to create network effects and he's done it
Yeah.
himself before, which lends credibility to it. And I've got a lot of key insights that I'm actually using in my go-to-market strategy from. And in terms of sort of books that have had an influence on my life, when I was a kid, I read this book, the book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win
Yeah.
Friends and Influence People. So things about like listening, being a good conversationalist and, you know, remembering people's names, like I've basically internalized that and I've literally seen it help my, day-to-day interactions so much. So that's something that no matter how young you are, maybe you need to be a little older than 13 to understand it. But yeah, that's a great book in general. And then I was a huge fan of Hemingway back in the day in my teenage angsty phase. So that's a little fiction
I
for you.
love that. I love, it's always good to hear the fiction, not requests, not referrals, but the suggested fiction rating because recommendations,
Recommendations.
thank you. Because
Yeah.
it's always, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
insightful on where I think a lot of founders need to spend time on to get away from the project, but also, I think it impacts kind of how you view philosophically or even strategically sometimes how you approach kind of building and everything like that. But the last little bit, is there anything I didn't ask you that I should?
You didn't ask me for the link to sign up for our beta, which is
That was coming
yeah,
next.
T-O yeah, toohla.com/sign up. That is toohla.com/sign up.
Amazing. And then where else can we find you? What are your LinkedIns? What are your websites? Where can we get involved and be supportive of the overall project?
Yeah, for sure. So the website is toohla.com, toohla.com. And yeah, and LinkedIn, you can check out the Toohla LinkedIn page. I haven't set up a Twitter account for the company yet, so it's just my personal Twitter for now, but that's coming soon.
Amazing. Well, I'm
Yeah.
excited to not only see kind of the progress where, Tula is going to go and where it's going to be, but also I'm excited to see that, kind of where it's built and how it has an overall effect. So Pranav, thank you so much for being on the show and I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Thanks, man. I really did. Yeah,
Awesome.
appreciate it.